Hi everybody, I'm KHOU 11 meteorologist Pat Cavlin coming to you from Houston, Texas with your final Hurricane Milton update just before it makes landfall along the west coast of Florida. Today is Wednesday, October 9th, 2024. Here's the latest update. Look, we're at the point with this storm. If you've been following us for the last few days, we've been doing analysis on the health of the storm, on how it looks on satellite, on how it's evolving. We are past that point now. We are within 12 hours of landfall, and we're basically at the moment where instead of really diagnosing and dissecting how the storm looks, we're just going to be looking at where it will be potentially going in terms of a landfall point and the impacts that we're going to see across the state of Florida. And the reason I just set that groundwork is because the National Hurricane Center is at the point where they are now updating the information on this storm, and they're putting out advisories every hour. So whatever I say is going to be out of date within an hour or two. So just take this with a grain of salt. Keep that in the back of your mind as you're watching this video. This is the look that we have with Hurricane Milton as of this afternoon. It's 1 p.m. Central Time. That's the advisory that we're working off of right now. Winds were sustained at 130 miles per hour. Pressure is coming up, so the storm is starting to show some signs of weakening, which was forecast, but with winds at 130 miles per hour, this is still a Category 4 storm as of the 1 p.m. Central Time update. A few things, though, that I do want to point out on satellite is I don't think the storm is ready to give up yet, and the reason I say that is because we're looking at infrared satellite here that shows us the temperature of the cloud tops. The theory behind this is, think of a hurricane as just a big collection of thunderstorms. The taller a thunderstorm, the more intense it is. The higher up in the atmosphere that thunderstorm reaches, the colder the tops of the clouds are, right? The higher you go, the colder it gets. So when you see cold cloud tops, it means these are intense thunderstorms, and so we kind of correlate that to the strength of a storm. And while we don't have an eye with this system right now because it went through an eye wall replacement cycle and now it's interacting with the jet stream, we do see some intense thunderstorms here along the northern and the northwestern quadrant of the storm. And you can tell that because the colors are going from that white to like almost a magenta shading, indicating cloud top temperatures that are under 80 degrees below 0 Celsius. So still a really intense storm here, and it is fighting for its life on that approach to the west coast of Florida. Another important thing, though, to point out, the movement now moving to the northeast. So it's moving north of northeast at about 15 miles per hour. This is the fastest the storm has moved in its lifetime. And this is also the most northerly component to its movement that it's taken in its lifetime. And why does that matter? Because the longer that storm goes north, the bigger at-risk areas like Tampa Bay will be to a direct hit. If it starts to take that turn towards the east a little sooner, then we're talking about impacts south of Tampa Bay in terms of storm surge and a direct landfall in, let's say, the Sarasota area. If it takes that turn even sooner, we're talking about a potential that maybe includes areas south of Sarasota. So we're talking about Port Charlotte into the Fort Myers area. That's why that movement is something that we're going to be watching like a hawk as we go through the rest of the afternoon. Tons of dry air in the atmosphere right now to the west, across the western Gulf of Mexico. This is because there's a very strong cold front that just came through these areas, and it's draped somewhere along this line here. And that is what's steering Milton right now into the Florida west coast. That's what's keeping this storm from making that sharp left turn into places like New Orleans, Alabama, or Mississippi, right? This is the giant wall that is keeping the storm in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. That dry air, however, has not gotten into the storm yet. It is a very, very well closed off storm. It still has a very just a very closed off core, which is keeping it from feeling the effects of the drier air. That being said, we've got the jet stream, which is diving right across the northern edge of this system, and that is having an impact on the strength of the system. That is shearing the top of the storm, and it is disrupting the flow and the circulation within the hurricane, which is why the winds are starting to go down, which is why the pressure is starting to go up. Both signs of a weakening storm. So the dry air isn't a factor yet. It is going to try to nose its way in along the back western quadrant here, but I think that's going to take some time. That probably won't happen until we get to that point of landfall. Here's a live look. We have live pictures, live of course being relative as we're recording this video, out towards Fort Myers Beach. So it's just before 3 p.m. Eastern time, local time here in Fort Myers Beach. You can see we still have a decent amount of real estate that's not, the storm surge really hasn't come into this area yet. That's the bottom line. The water levels are starting to come up on the beach, but you can see these are where the buildings are, okay, in that lower right-hand corner. And so we still have a decent amount of real estate on the beach where the water hasn't gotten up to yet. This is going to be a totally different camera shot in about 6 to 8 hours. We're expecting significant, if not catastrophic, storm surge here in the city of Fort Myers Beach. And I got to tell you, as someone that worked and lived in Fort Myers and somebody that just 2 years ago was watching Hurricane Ian go into this area, it's heartbreaking, but two, it is so eerie and so reminiscent of what we watched with Ian. You know, that turn to the east, the storm surge coming in and destroying these areas. And at this point, even if the storm does make landfall up in the Tampa Bay area, we're still going to see significant storm surge here in Southwest Florida. So Charlotte Harbor down to Fort Myers Beach, that's kind of baked into the cake, unfortunately. So that's what we're looking at here in this part of the world. This is a look at radar and wind, and the wind gust reports have varied quite a bit across this area. Again, as of this video right now, generally tropical storm force winds around 30 to 35 miles per hour. Some bigger gusts, though, down towards Naples now, over 50 miles per hour. That Clewiston site here along Lake Okeechobee, that is now out. I bet that's probably a power outage. They've had some really intense thunderstorms out that way so far this morning. And that brings me to the next point. These storms that are part of the outer bands, the feeder bands of this storm, of this hurricane, are producing tornadoes like crazy. I know it's kind of hard to see the colors on this map, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 active tornado warnings right now as I'm making this video just before 3 p.m. Eastern time. This has been a prolific tornado outbreak across the Florida Peninsula, and these aren't just warnings. We've actually had confirmation and videos and photos of tornadoes actually on the ground. It is common to see tornadoes with hurricanes, with landfalls, but the amount that we have seen with this storm and the intensity of these tornadoes has been a little more unusual. And so for that reason, the Storm Prediction Center placing Central Florida under a threat level 3 out of 5, 5 being the highest, a threat level 3 for severe weather, and it is a tornado-driven threat, and it's a significant tornado threat. And to be honest, this is, I think, one of the few times, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but this is one of the few times that we've actually seen a level 3, an enhanced risk for severe weather associated with a landfalling tropical system. All right, back to the hurricane now. Hurricane hunters are flying in this storm right now. They've done 2, 3 passes now through the center of the system. So far, the surface pressure they found was 929. I think it's starting to come up a bit. Obviously, the pressure in the last report was 944, and that's why we haven't seen this number update, because this shows us the lowest pressure. So this was earlier on. Wind speed values, I'm interested to see what they're finding in there, because so far we haven't seen anything stronger than this. But they're flying in this storm. They're going to be flying through this thing all day long. Mission after mission will come through here up until the point of the system making landfall. So there it is. This is the latest forecast now from the National Hurricane Center. The cone is pretty much centered over where it's been now for the last 4 or 5 days. Landfall is expected anywhere from Tampa Bay to Charlotte Harbor, which is just north of the Fort Myers area in Southwest Florida. We expect landfall sometime tonight or late this evening as a major Category 3 hurricane. That's where things stand right now. So, just a word of caution, and I say this not to panic or worry anybody, but just to kind of bring things back to perspective. This is not a guaranteed forecast track for the storm. 66% of the time, the storm will stay inside of that cone, but there are times where the storm will deviate outside of that cone. And this also just tells you where the core of the storm may end up going. This doesn't show you the impacts. The impacts from this storm are going to be felt in this area. And I'm not exaggerating, and I'm not being facetious. This is really the area that is going to see the greatest impacts from this storm. We're talking about incredible storm surge here along the Southwest Florida coast. You're talking about a tornado threat in the middle of the state. And then, believe it or not, as the storm moves across the peninsula, still as a hurricane, the wraparound winds on the backside will lead to more storm surge here across the Nature Coast into Tampa Bay, and then also on the Florida East Coast, parts of St. Augustine totally evacuated because of that storm surge threat on the northeastern coast of the state. So a very impactful system here as we go through the next 24 to 36 hours. Here's what the latest model plots are showing in terms of the best guess for landfall. You can see they're still pretty clustered from, let's say, the Venice Beach area up to Pinellas County, so where St. Petersburg is. That's where the biggest cluster is. We have a couple of outliers that go to the south, but this is really the best clustering that we have at the moment. And so confidence is a little higher, and that's why the forecast cone from the Hurricane Center basically outlines that area as well. But this is not an impact map. This is just showing you where the eye of the storm goes. Impacts are going to be big time to the south of the storm in the form of deadly storm surge. So what's happening right now is Milton is interacting with the jet stream. Remember that cold front that I showed you at the beginning of the video that's diving through the western half of the Gulf? That's tied in with the jet stream, and the jet stream is ripping this thing, or trying to rip this thing apart. The farther north the storm goes, the more it's going to get shredded. Unfortunately, it's just not going to be enough at this point before landfall to totally tear this thing to shreds, which is why it will still be a Category 3 storm at landfall. But that is why we are seeing weakening. Even though water temperatures are high, even though dry air is staying to the west for the time being, it's the wind shear that's really doing a big number on this system and will continue to do so as we go through the next few days. Here's future track, and you can see how the storm becomes very lopsided. Big time rain totals. I mean, flooding concerns along I-4 and going north towards the Big Bend and Nature Coast. The south side, though, barely any rain once we get into the evening and the overnight. But that's, again, just one part of the equation. You're going to get big time storm surge on the south side of the system. Huge rain and wind threat here, again, along the I-4 corridor, up into Orlando, getting up towards the First Coast, from St. Augustine, basically from Titusville all the way up towards Jacksonville. And for the folks that may be watching from the Carolinas that are still trying to get back on their feet from Helene, this is not your storm. This storm is going to make a beeline for the Atlantic as it weakens through the end of the week and the weekend. So this is done. And the only hit that we're having here in the United States from this storm is going to be across central Florida. So Georgia, Carolinas, you're totally fine from this. Even the heavy rain should mainly stay offshore. Let's talk winds now, because yesterday this storm was very compact. In fact, the last few days, it's been very compact. That is why it has been able to fluctuate in intensity so rapidly. That's why this became one of the strongest storms on record, because the eye was a pinhole size, only a couple of miles in diameter across. And when you have those smaller storms, think of a figure skater. As they wind up their arms, they spin faster and faster. That's what hurricanes do. But conversely, think about when that figure skater starts to open the arms again, they slow down, but they're covering more area. That's exactly what's going to happen with this storm. It has now started to expand. The wind field is double, triple in size of what it was just 2 days ago. And so the wind impacts aren't just at the coast, but they go inland as well. Wind gusts this evening will into hurricane force here across, again, the Tampa Bay area, getting down towards southwest Florida. And then as we get into the overnight, it's now for areas like Lakeland, getting into Orlando, Deltona, out towards the Space Coast. So again, along I-4, this storm pretty much follows that path across the state. And now on the backside, we've got winds screaming in from the north and east, and this is where storm surge becomes an issue for the First Coast. So from Daytona Beach up towards St. Augustine and Jacksonville, we're talking about enormous amounts of storm surge potential as the winds are ripping in from the Atlantic. On the south side, you've just got winds doing damage and taking out power across the Orlando area into the Space Coast, and then from there the storm goes out to sea. The biggest threat, the most devastating thing that you are going to see in the next 24 hours is the storm surge. I don't know if there is a way to really convey what we're about to watch on the west coast of Florida here. It will be reminiscent of Ian. and I think even on a bigger scale. And a bigger scale because it's impacting a large portion of the Florida West Coast instead of making landfall in Fort Myers and just impacting areas down to Collier County. This is going to be making landfall somewhere probably around Sarasota and impacting everything south of there. You're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people impacted, and you're talking about some record-setting storm surge for a lot of these areas. So right now, Tampa Bay expected to see 8 to 12 feet of storm surge. That would be a record for this area. You're talking about storm surge values potentially higher than that of what we saw with Helene. Just keep that in mind for perspective. Farther down the coast, Sarasota, Venice, Englewood, you're talking about 9 to 13 feet of storm surge. And then even farther south than that, areas like Punta Gorda, Port Charlotte, Bokeelia, Gasparilla, getting into the Lee County Islands, Captiva, and then into Fort Myers itself. The storm surge here is going to be unbelievable. This hurricane will make landfall 50, 80 miles to your north, and you're still going to see tremendous amounts of water coming on shore in these areas. Fort Myers and Fort Myers Beach were the areas hit hardest by Hurricane Ian 2 years ago. And Charlotte Harbor was actually spared the worst just because of where the landfall ended up. This will not be the case. This could be some of the worst storm surge that Charlotte Harbor has ever seen in its modern existence. So folks that live in these areas, the Cape Hayes Peninsula, I mean, you could be seeing storm surge like you have never experienced before. There are going to be areas that have been built up over the last few decades that have never seen this before. That's the kind of storm that we're talking about, unfortunately. And so heeding those evacuation orders is just so critical. This is the map that really dives into what I'm talking about. I know there's a lot going on. There's a lot of colors on this map. But basically where you see the color is where you see the storm rise, okay? So this is the Cape Hayes Peninsula. This is Port Charlotte up here. This is Punta Gorda down here, okay? So we're talking about water. These values where we see 3 feet, 6 feet, 9 feet, we're not talking about 9 feet above sea level. We are talking about sea water getting to the front door of your house, and if you're in the red area, it's going to be 9 feet above your feet. So we're talking about 9 feet above ground level, not above sea level. That's what these storm surge values indicate. So places like Rotunda, getting up into Englewood, and these are beautiful beaches up here, by the way, gorgeous beaches. This is going to be devastating, and beautiful beach communities as well that are going to be underwater. We're talking about over 6 feet of storm surge for a lot of these areas, and then when you get into the red, okay, for the southern Cape Hayes Peninsula, totally underwater, under 9 feet at least of storm surge. Then we go over the bridge here, we get into Port Charlotte. We're talking about major storm surge here, over 9 feet of storm surge for coastal Port Charlotte. Once you get north of 776 here, okay, that's where the storm surge threat dissipates. But south of that, again, along the port here, big issues. The US 41 and the I-75 bridges, I mean, they may be underwater as well. Think about that. Then you cross over. Punta Gorda is going to see some of the worst of this, and there's no other way to put that. You're talking about a really tight gradient here. There's the Punta Gorda Airport. So if you live around the Punta Gorda Airport, you're going to be fine. If you live anywhere west of that, you're going to be underwater, under some amount of water. Whether it's 3 feet, 9 feet, 12 feet, that's what the forecast is calling for right now. All of downtown Punta Gorda underwater. That's what this is looking like as the forecast stands right now. Farther to the south, more bad news. Lee County Islands, totally overrun with storm surge. From Captiva to Sanibel, Pine Island. The immediate center of Pine Island will be spared. The highest part of the island, right there, the spine of the middle of it, that'll be spared. Cape Coral, a city of canals. If you're not familiar with Cape Coral, that's all it is. It's canals. And a lot of that water from the Gulf of Mexico is going to be pushed into the mouth of the Caloosahatchee, and from there, it's going to have to go somewhere, so it'll start filling into the capillaries, which are the canals that go into Cape Coral and North Fort Myers. This area up here, a very close friend of mine. She's the chief meteorologist at the NBC station here. She lives in North Fort Myers. She had so much water in her home from Ian, and I am afraid that they are going to see a lot of flooding again from this storm. So North Fort Myers getting into Cape Coral, quite the setup that's developing here. And then, of course, Fort Myers Beach yet again underwater. And then parts of Fort Myers here on the south side could see quite a bit of water. And just getting in for a closer look, downtown Fort Myers up here may see some water into the downtown like they did with Ian. But it does look like the worst of this will be as you get closer to the Gulf of Mexico. Again, west side of Cape Coral, getting out towards Pine Island. I'll stand on this side. Getting out towards Pine Island, that's where we're going to see some of the worst of this. And then down towards the Iona-McGregor neighborhoods is where you're going to see some of this out towards Punta Rassa. Big time storm surge for these areas. So what impacts storm surge? It is the exact track. I know I just focused on the Port Charlotte and Southwest Florida areas. But if this storm goes right into Pinellas County and St. Petersburg, all of that water is still going to go into Port Charlotte, but it also comes into Tampa Bay. And Tampa Bay is a bowl. That water will have nowhere to go. And so just like I just showed you with the storm surge inundation maps, it starts to fill those capillaries. It starts to fill those canals. It starts to fill those rivers, those streams, and then eventually it overflows its banks and goes into neighborhoods and starts to flood things. It is such a fine forecast that if it just goes 20 miles, 30 miles, 40 miles south, Tampa Bay is spared. You get the reverse storm surge because winds come in from the north, water comes out of the bay, and the areas to the south get a bigger impact. We are not going to have the answer on exactly where that landfall is, which is why such a large portion of the west coast of Florida has been evacuated, because at the end of the day, you can't evacuate 100,000, 400,000, 600,000 people from storm surge with 6 hours of notice. Okay, you just can't do it. That's the answer. And that's why they start these evacuation orders days in advance to get you out of harm's way. Again, best case scenario, you evacuate, you come back the next day, your home is still there. Worst case scenario, you stay and you end up on the roof of your house in the middle of a hurricane. And again, the folks in Fort Myers Beach, they went through this 2 years ago. And those that stayed, asked them if they would do that again. The answer is probably going to be no. So big time impacts there from storm surge. That's the latest with Milton. As of this afternoon, it's a waiting game. We are on the cusp of seeing something absolutely tragic on the west coast of Florida. We're thinking of everybody there. We're watching the forecast. Please stay safe. Remember, you run from water, you hide from wind. If you live anywhere in the path of this storm, once those winds start to pick up in intensity, make sure that you find an interior room, a safe place to be, and hunker down until the storm is over. All of this gets out of here as we get into tomorrow afternoon. Until then, stay safe, and thanks for watching this video.